Jeffrey Sachs, the world-renowned economist, didn't mince words during his address to the European Parliament. His message was stark. U.S. foreign policy is a leading cause of global instability. Sachs, known for his direct style, pointed to conflicts in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa as evidence. Sachs argued that the U.S., since the end of the Cold War, has relentlessly pursued global dominance. He stated that this pursuit has come at a tremendous cost, fueling conflicts and undermining international stability. His words resonated with some members of the parliament, while others met his claims with skepticism. Sachs's speech, however, wasn't just a condemnation of U.S. foreign policy. It was a call to action, particularly for Europe. He urged European nations to break free from what he sees as subservience to U.S. interests. He implored them to chart their own course, one based on diplomacy, cooperation, and sustainable development. To understand Sachs's critique, one must revisit the aftermath of the Cold War. The year was 1991. The Soviet Union, the West's ideological rival for decades, had crumbled. Sachs, then an economic advisor to the Russian government, proposed a Marshall Plan for the former Soviet republics. His plan aimed to stabilize their economies and integrate them into the global order. The U.S., however, had other plans. According to Sachs, the U.S. saw an opportunity to establish itself as the sole superpower. It prioritized expanding its sphere of influence, often through military means. This approach, Sachs argued, laid the groundwork for future conflicts. The expansion of NATO, the Western military alliance eastward, was a key part of this strategy. Sachs argued that NATO expansion, despite warnings from Russia, was a deliberate provocation. It shattered the post-Cold War peace and sowed the seeds of future conflict, most notably in Ukraine. NATO, formed in 1949 as a bulwark against Soviet aggression, found new purpose after the Cold War. The alliance, led by the United States, began admitting former Soviet satellite states into its ranks. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were the first to join in 1999. This expansion, according to Sachs, was unnecessary and reckless. Russia, still reeling from the loss of its empire, saw NATO expansion as a threat. It viewed the alliance's movement toward its borders as a hostile act, a betrayal of assurances given during the reunification of Germany. Despite Russian protests, NATO continued to expand, admitting more Eastern European countries in subsequent years. Sachs argued that this expansion was a major strategic blunder. It alienated Russia, pushing it further into isolation and resentment. It also created new divisions in Europe between those who supported NATO expansion and those who saw it as unnecessarily provocative. This, Sachs argued, set the stage for the crisis in Ukraine. Ukraine, a former Soviet republic strategically located on Russia's border, became a focal point of tensions between Russia and the West. In 2014, following a popular uprising that ousted the pro-Russian president, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, a Ukrainian territory with a majority Russian population. Russia also backed separatists in eastern Ukraine, who launched a war against the Ukrainian government. Sachs argued that the Ukraine crisis was a direct consequence of NATO expansion. He stated that the U.S., by encouraging Ukraine to join NATO, had crossed a red line for Russia. Russia's actions, while illegal under international law, were a predictable response to what it perceived as an existential threat. The conflict in Ukraine, according to Sachs, is a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. He argued that both sides are more interested in pursuing geopolitical goals than in finding a peaceful resolution. The suffering of the Ukrainian people, he lamented, is a tragic consequence of this great power rivalry. Section 5. The Middle East, a theater of intervention. Sachs's critique of U.S. foreign policy extends beyond Europe. He argued that the U.S. has a long history of intervention in the Middle East, often with disastrous consequences. He pointed to the 2003 invasion of Iraq as a prime example. The Iraq War, launched on the pretext of Saddam Hussein's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, threw the region into chaos. The war, according to Sachs, was based on false pretenses and driven by a desire for regime change and control of Iraq's oil reserves. It led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, displaced millions more, and created a power vacuum that allowed groups like ISIS to flourish. The U.S. intervention in Iraq, Sachs argued, was a major strategic blunder with devastating consequences for the region. Similar criticisms were leveled against U.S. interventions in Syria, Libya, and other countries in the region. Sachs argued that these interventions, often conducted under the banner of humanitarian intervention or democracy promotion, have only served to exacerbate conflicts and destabilize the region. Section 6. Africa. Exploitation under the guise of aid. Sachs didn't spare Africa from his critique. He argued that while the United States often presents itself as a benevolent actor in Africa, its policies are often driven by self-interest and have contributed to the continent's problems. He pointed to the numerous military interventions, often justified in the name of fighting terrorism, as evidence of this. These interventions, Sachs argued, often destabilize the region, creating power vacuums that allow extremist groups to thrive. He also criticized the West's approach to development aid, arguing that it's often conditional and focused on promoting Western interests rather than genuinely empowering African nations. He cited examples of aid being tied to economic policies that benefit Western corporations while harming local industries. This approach, Sachs argued, perpetuates a cycle of dependency and hinders Africa's ability to chart its own course. Sachs challenged the notion that the West is solely interested in Africa's well-being. He pointed to the exploitation of Africa's natural resources by Western corporations, often with the complicity of corrupt local governments. This exploitation, he argued, deprives African nations of the resources they need to develop, and perpetuates a system where the West benefits at Africa's expense. Section 7. Europe's Faustian bargain. Sachs argued that Europe, by aligning itself so closely with the United States, has become complicit in its destabilizing foreign policies. He criticized European leaders for failing to stand up to the United States and for prioritizing their relationship with Washington over their own interests and values. This subservience, he argued, has made Europe a junior partner in a foreign policy agenda that is often at odds with its own values and interests. He pointed to Europe's participation in the Iraq War, despite widespread public opposition, as an example of this subservience. He argued that Europe allowed itself to be pressured into supporting a war that was based on lies and that has had disastrous consequences for the region. This decision, he argued, damaged Europe's credibility and undermined its standing in the world. Sachs argued that Europe needs to break free from this subservience and chart its own course. He called on European leaders to develop an independent foreign policy based on diplomacy, multilateralism, and respect for international law. He argued that Europe, with its history of diplomacy and its commitment to multilateral institutions, is uniquely positioned to play a leading role in building a more peaceful and just world order. Section 8. A call for change. Sachs's vision for a new world order. Despite his scathing critique, Sachs didn't offer just doom and gloom. He outlined a vision for a different kind of world order, one based on cooperation, diplomacy, and sustainable development. He called for a fundamental shift in global governance, away from the current system where a handful of powerful nations dictate the rules to one where all countries have a say. This new system, he argued, should be based on the principles of multilateralism, respect for international law, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. He emphasized the need for a renewed focus on diplomacy and dialogue. He argued that too many conflicts are allowed to fester and escalate because of a lack of communication and understanding. He called for increased investment in diplomacy, both at the government level and through civil society organizations, to build bridges and foster dialogue between different cultures and perspectives. Sachs also highlighted the importance of sustainable development in achieving lasting peace. He argued that poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation are all drivers of conflict. Addressing these root causes, he argued, is essential for building a more peaceful and just world. He called for increased investment in sustainable development, both domestically and through international cooperation, to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Section 9. A seed of hope. Sachs's speech, while critical, wasn't devoid of hope. He argued that a different world is possible, one where cooperation trumps conflict and where all nations work together to address shared challenges. He called on European leaders to be architects of this new world order, to use their influence and their values to build a more peaceful and just world. His words resonated with many in the audience, particularly those who have long been critical of U.S. foreign policy. They saw in Sachs's vision a path forward, a way to break free from the cycle of conflict and create a world where diplomacy and cooperation prevail. While it remains to be seen whether Sacks's words will lead to concrete action, his speech was a powerful reminder of the need for a new approach to global governance. It was a call to action, a challenge to all of us to build a world where peace and cooperation are not just aspirations, but lived realities.
So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and let's turn the page on a new adventure together. Get ready to experience books like never before, only on VBook 360. Like, comment, and share to support the channel and keep the video magic alive. Thank you for stopping by. And remember, every video has a story, and every story deserves to be shared. See you in the next video.